Welcome. I'm so thrilled you're joining us today. We are taking you right to the front lines of, well, one of the most staggering historical events of the 20th century. For this deep dive, we're unpacking a phenomenally detailed set of notes and historical records from a massive Wikipedia article all about Operation Michael.
It really is a defining moment. We're looking at a masterclass in the stark difference between, a tactical success on the battlefield and a strategic victory that actually wins a war.
Right. So, to put you right in the middle of it, it is the spring of 1918. The Eastern Front has collapsed. Russia is officially out of the war via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and for the first time in years, Germany has a massive numbers advantage in the West.
Yeah, but they also have a ticking clock.
Exactly. The Americans are coming. Our mission today is to explore the revolutionary tactics the Germans unleashed, the utterly terrifying human experience on the ground, and how a military operation that successfully captured a massive amount of territory ended up being, well, a catastrophic failure.
The stakes here are almost impossible to overstate. We have to look at Operation Michael not just as a sequence of battles, but as a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. The German High Command knew they were rolling the dice on the survival of their entire empire.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the geopolitical reality of early 1918. The German people on the home front are essentially starving due to the protracted war and the Allied naval blockade. The pressure is immense.
Immense.
But because Russia has surrendered, the German quartermaster general, Erich Ludendorff, suddenly has a massive influx of manpower. How significant was this shift in numbers?
Oh, it was a game changer on paper. Ludendorff was able to transfer nearly 50 divisions from the Eastern Front over to the West.
Wow.
Yeah. Suddenly, Germany boasts 192 divisions on the Western Front, and out of those, 110 are positioned right on the front line. For the first time in a long time, they significantly outnumbered the Allies in that theater.
But having the numbers on paper is very different from deploying them effectively, right? Especially with that ticking clock we mentioned.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to realize just how loud that clock was ticking in Ludendorff's ear. He knew that 318,000 fresh American soldiers were expected to land in France by May of 1918.
And another million by August, right?
Exactly, 1 million by August. The German High Command knew their window to win the war was rapidly closing. Once the American Expeditionary Force was fully built up and integrated into the lines, Germany simply couldn't compete with that level of fresh manpower and industrial output.
So Ludendorff comes up with this wildly ambitious do-or-die strategy. I know the goal was to target the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, but what was the actual mechanical plan here?
The grand strategy was to hit the British incredibly hard at a specific junction point, separate them from the French army to the south, and then aggressively wheel northwest.
Towards the...
Right. The ultimate goal was to push the British all the way into the sea by cutting off the Channel ports. Those ports were absolutely vital for British supplies and reinforcements. Trap them in Flanders, force a surrender, and then turn the entire German military apparatus on the French before the Americans arrive in force.
And the British lines were sitting ducks for this, particularly General Hubert Gough's Fifth Army.
Sitting ducks is putting it mildly. They were incredibly vulnerable, precisely where the Germans planned to strike. Gough's Fifth Army had recently taken over a massive 42-mile stretch of the front line for the French.
42 miles is huge.
It is, and calling it a line is being generous.
Yeah.
The defenses were dangerously incomplete. They lacked the troops to hold it properly, so they were relying on isolated outposts, massive gaps, and completely unfinished rear zones.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Germans didn't just plan to overwhelm these weak points with sheer numbers, they completely changed the fundamental way warfare was fought, creating these elite infantry units called Stormtrooper or Stormtroopers. How did these units operate differently from what we typically picture when we think of World War I?
That is the crucial tactical shift right there. For years, the standard doctrine involved throwing massive, slow-moving waves of men at heavily defended trenches. It was just a meat grinder.
Right, walking slowly across no man's land.
Exactly. But these new stormtrooper units were trained in infiltration tactics. Instead of attacking the strongest points head-on, they moved in small, highly trained, autonomous groups. Their orders were to completely bypass the heavy defenses, slip through the gaps in the line, and race forward as fast as possible to disrupt communications, attack headquarters, and destroy artillery in the rear.
It sounds like modern special forces tactics being born right there in the mud. And to support them, they completely overhauled their artillery strategy too. Instead of the classic bombardment that would last for a week and basically just warn the enemy an attack was coming, they used something called a hurricane bombardment.
Think of it as maximum shock and awe. It was a brief, incredibly complex, highly destructive barrage that lasted only a few hours. It was meticulously coordinated to sever telephone wires, knock out heavy guns, and maintain the absolute element of surprise right up until the very second the infantry charged out of the trenches.
Which perfectly exposed the fatal flaw in the British defense strategy for this specific sector. The British were using a defense-in-depth strategy in their forward zone.
They were, and it was specifically designed to rely on small, isolated redoubts, essentially fortified mini-bunkers that provided overlapping machine gun crossfire. If an enemy attacked, they would be caught in a deadly web of intersecting bullets.
Right.
But as you'll see, that entire strategy relied on one critical factor, the ability to actually see the enemy coming.
So let's put you on the ground on the morning of March 21st, 1918. It's 4:40 a.m. The largest artillery barrage of the entire war begins. What did that actually look and sound like for a soldier waking up to this?
The sheer scale of it is almost unimaginable to modern minds. In just 5 hours, the Germans fired over 3.5 million shells.
3.5 million in 5 hours.
It's staggering. And it wasn't just high explosives. It was a terrifying, suffocating mix of mustard gas, chlorine gas, tear gas, and smoke canisters, blanketing an area of 400 square kilometers.
It's horrific.
Winston Churchill was actually inspecting a division near the front that morning, and his description is chilling. He said it was exactly as a pianist runs his hands across the keyboard from treble to bass. He said there rose, in less than 1 minute, the most tremendous cannonade he would ever hear. He noted that the enormous explosions upon the trenches seemed almost to touch each other, with hardly an interval in space or time.
Just an apocalyptic wall of fire and poison. And then, around 9:40 a.m., the bombardment lifts, and the German infantry assault begins. But nature decides to intervene with a freakishly thick morning mist.
A literal fog of war.
Yeah.
It was so dense that visibility dropped to barely 10 yards. So those British redoubts we talked about in the forward zone, the mini bunkers relying on overlapping crossfire to defend the line, they were completely blind. Entirely. The German stormtroopers, utilizing their new infiltration tactics, just slipped right past them in the thick fog, completely unseen.
The chaos must have been absolute. Telephone wires are shredded by the hurricane bombardment. Human runners carrying messages are getting completely lost in the dense fog and the gas clouds. British headquarters are totally cut off, meaning generals have zero ability to influence the battle.
And the troops garrisoned in those forward zone redoubts suddenly found themselves completely surrounded by Germans who had materialized out of the mist behind them. Some units, once they ran out of ammunition, had no choice but to surrender. Others fought to the very last man.
Which leads to an agonizing period from March 22 to March 25. The British are forced into a desperate fighting retreat.
This raises an important question about how fractured leadership operates under extreme duress. In the midst of this overwhelming chaos, communication broke down from the very top. There was a disastrous misunderstanding between the 5th Army Commander, General Gough, and his Corps Commander, General Ivor Maxse.
What?
Gough had ordered a fighting retreat, but only if necessary to maintain the line. Maxse, dealing with fragmented reports and immense pressure, misinterpreted this to mean his entire corps should fall back to the Somme River immediately.
A single misunderstood order cascading into a catastrophe. Because of that, the British 8th Corps retreated way further than intended. They abandoned highly defensible terrain and moved over 14 kilometers back, essentially blowing a massive hole in their own lines.
But even amid that strategic collapse, the micro-level heroism is staggering. You have individuals like Lieutenant Colonel Wilfred Elstob at a redoubt called Manchester Hill. He commanded his garrison to fight off repeated assaults from all sides. He personally carried ammunition through heavy fire and held out until he was killed late in the afternoon of March 22. They fought and died simply to buy a few precious hours for the rest of the army to fall back.
While the British are frantically retreating, the advancing German troops are running into something that profoundly alters the momentum of the battle. And it wasn't a fortified trench, it was the British supply dumps.
This is one of those deeply human details you only find when you dig into the sources. You have to remember the context we started with. The German home front was starving. The German soldiers were constantly fed propaganda stating that their U-boat blockades were starving the Allies into submission, just like the British naval blockade was starving Germany.
Right, so these hungry, exhausted German stormtroopers overrun the British camps, expecting to find an enemy as deprived as they are. Instead, they find an absolute abundance of high-quality food. The sources mention them finding luxuries like chocolate, tinned meats, and even champagne.
Imagine the psychological blow. You are pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance, watching your friends die for miles of mud, believing the enemy is on the verge of collapse. Then you capture their trenches and realize you've been lied to. The Allies aren't starving. They are incredibly well supplied.
It must have been devastating.
It was. Instead of being thrilled by the plunder, many German units were profoundly demoralized. Some units even stopped their advance entirely just to gorge themselves on the captured rations, completely losing their tactical momentum.
That is fascinating to really understand what that exhaustion looked like. The war diaries from the individual British units are incredibly revealing. I was looking at the accounts of the 11th Hertfordshire Regiment and the 54th Brigade.
Those diaries ground you entirely in the perspective of the individual soldier. It strips away the grand strategy and leaves you with the brutal reality of survival.
Exactly. Reading those accounts, it's just a relentless nightmare sequence. Falling back, digging hasty trenches in the dark, realizing you're being outflanked, losing commanding officers to sniper fire, and retreating again. They were marching continuously through the night, getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep over a span of 5 days.
And yet, amidst that total physical and mental depletion, you have this incredible anomaly on March 25. The 54th Brigade is essentially a shadow of its former self. They've been fighting and marching for 4 punishing days. Suddenly, a rider arrives with surprise orders countermanding their retreat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are told to turn around, form up, and launch a counterattack against a village called Babowef.
And against all physical logic, these exhausted men do it. They literally turn around, surprise the advancing Germans, who fully believed they were only chasing ragged, fleeing units, and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat for 20 minutes among the cornfields. The British completely retake the village.
They captured 230 German prisoners and seized 10 heavy machine guns in that single action.
The sources even note they were finally able to bring up their cooking limbers after securing the village to have their first hot meal in days.
Which were essentially mobile, horse-drawn field kitchens. It's a surreal image. Enjoying a hot meal in a freshly recaptured village surrounded by the chaos of a collapsing front. It stands as an unbelievable testament to the resilience of those specific soldiers.
It really does. And it seems like these fierce local stands, like the 54th Brigade at Babowef, finally started to physically stall the German momentum. Did this buy the Allies the breathing room they needed to fix their fractured command structure?
It bought them just enough time to avert total disaster, yes. The sheer scale of the German advance was threatening to permanently split the British and French armies, which would have ended the war. This existential crisis forced the Allied leadership to do something they had been fiercely resisting for years due to national pride and differing strategic goals. They had to unify their command structure.
Because up until this point, the British reported to British command and the French reported to French command, and they were often working at cross purposes.
Precisely. General Haig was worried about protecting the Channel ports, while General Pétain was worried about protecting Paris. But at the Doullens Conference on March 26, the Allied leaders finally met and appointed French General Ferdinand Foch as the supreme Allied commander, the Generalissimo. Finally, the British and French forces were coordinating under one central, cohesive strategy.
Meanwhile, the massive German offensive is starting to crack under its own weight. The logistics are completely failing. But it wasn't just a matter of supply lines being too long, right? It was what they were trying to cross.
You have to picture the physical reality of the terrain. The Germans were advancing over the old 1916 Somme battlefield. This wasn't open countryside. It was a lunar landscape.
Oh, right. The craters.
It was a wasteland of overlapping artillery craters, poisoned wells, rotting corpses from 2 years prior, and shattered roads. Trying to drag heavy artillery pieces and horse-drawn supply wagons through that nightmare while under aerial harassment was nearly impossible. The infantry simply outran their own ability to be fed or rearmed.
And Ludendorff himself makes a massive unforced error here. Instead of keeping his eyes on the prize, the Channel ports, he gets distracted.
It's a classic case of military hubris. Ludendorff became intoxicated by his early tactical successes. Instead of concentrating all his elite forces on one decisive breakthrough toward the sea, he started chasing local victories. He spread his forces out. He launched a secondary offensive called Operation Myers against the heavily defended British Third Army up at Arras, abandoning his strategic discipline.
And how did that go?
It was a complete failure. The Germans hit a brick wall.
And to make matters worse for the Germans, the Allies started deploying new technologies to hit back. Near a place called Calling Camps, the British debuted their brand new Whippet tanks.
These were a significant departure from the older, lumbering Mark IV tanks that moved at a walking pace. The Whippets were much lighter, faster, and designed specifically to exploit gaps in the enemy line.
The accounts say just 12 of these Whippets suddenly appeared on the battlefield and charged into the German lines, completely scattering 300 highly trained stormtroopers who fled in absolute panic. It must have felt like the technological tide was turning against them in real time.
And it was. The whole offensive finally fizzled out in early April. The critical, culminating moment was the fighting around Villers-Bretonneux on April 4th and 5th. Ludendorff made one final desperate push to capture the high ground overlooking the vital railway city of Amiens. If Amiens fell, the Allied rail network would be paralyzed.
Yet they didn't get it.
No. A hastily organized night counterattack by Australian forces and British units, including the very same exhausted men of the 54th Brigade we talked about earlier, halted the German advance dead in its tracks. The Germans simply could go no further.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the raw data, the sheer scale of Operation Michael is just unbelievable. The Germans advanced up to 40 miles into Allied territory. They captured 3,100 square kilometers of France. They took over 75,000 British soldiers prisoner and captured 1,300 artillery pieces and 200 tanks. If you just look at a map, it looks like a massive, undeniable victory.
But the crucial analysis here is that, despite those terrifying metrics, it was a catastrophic strategic failure for the German Empire. Consider what they actually captured. Useless, shell-torn wilderness from the 1916 battles. They completely failed to capture the vital rail hubs of Amiens or Arras, and they never reached the channel ports. And the human cost was staggering. The Germans suffered roughly 250,000 casualties. The Allies suffered roughly 255,000 casualties.
And here is the vital difference in those casualty numbers. The Allies could replace their losses. The Americans were pouring into France by the hundreds of thousands, and British factories were churning out 10,000 machine guns and 100 tanks every single month. But the 250,000 men the Germans lost, those were their absolute best, highly trained, irreplaceable elite troops.
Precisely. Ludendorff bled his army dry for ground he couldn't even defend. Tactical brilliance without strategic discipline loses wars.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this intense historical journey today. Operation Michael truly changed the tactical face of war forever with the introduction of infiltration tactics and hurricane bombardments. But as we've seen, it ultimately marked the beginning of the end for the German Empire in World War I.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, specifically regarding the core of the German tactical shift, the creation of the Stormtrooper. The German military explicitly skimmed the absolute best, fittest, and most experienced soldiers from every regular unit across their entire army to create these elite shock troops. This pooling of talent ensured that their initial attacks on March 21st would be devastatingly effective, but it also mathematically guaranteed that their highest casualties in the vanguard of the assault would be their most irreplaceable men. When those elite troops fell, Germany was left with severely degraded, lower-quality, exhausted troops in reserve. Did the very military innovation that made their attack so brilliantly effective initially actually seal their ultimate doom?
That is a fascinating question to chew on, the paradox of the elite vanguard. Keep questioning history and always look for those hidden connections in the stories we think we know. Until next time, take care and keep diving deep.